At some point, roughly 10,000 years ago, human beings made a decision that changed everything. They gave up their freedom. They gave up their leisure time. They gave up the variety in their diet. They gave up their physical health. Their bones became thinner. Their teeth rotted. Their average height dropped by several centimeters. They gave up the ability to pick up and move when conditions got bad. They gave up, in many ways, the lives their ancestors had lived successfully for hundreds of thousands of years. And in exchange, they got wheat. Not even bread yet. Just wheat. The ability to grow a grain in the ground, tend it, harvest it, process it, and eat it. A deal that, on paper, looks like one of the worst trades in the history of our species. And yet, and this is what makes it so fascinating, that trade didn't just sustain civilization. It built it. The cities, the writing, the governments, the religions, the wars, the art, the science, the entire scaffolding of what we call human history. None of it exists without grain, without bread. The question worth asking is, did we choose this? Did humans consciously decide to settle down and farm? Or did bread, in some strange and roundabout way, choose us? Today, we are going to follow a single ingredient, from a wild grass on the hillsides of the ancient Middle East to the loaf sitting on your kitchen counter, and find out what it actually cost us to get here. To understand what agriculture meant, you first need to understand what came before it. For the vast majority of human existence, for roughly 95% of the time that anatomically modern Homo sapiens have been on Earth, we were hunter-gatherers. We did not plant things. We did not stay in one place. We moved with the seasons, following game, harvesting wild plants, fishing, foraging. We lived in small bands of 20 to 50 people, and we were, by most anthropological measures, remarkably successful. Here is what the evidence actually tells us about hunter-gatherer life, and it may surprise you. Hunter-gatherers were not struggling. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer populations, the Kungsan, the Hadza, various groups in the Amazon, consistently show that obtaining sufficient food typically takes somewhere between 3 and 5 hours a day. The anthropologist Marshall Salins famously called hunter-gatherer societies the original affluent society, not because they had a lot of stuff, but because their needs were modest and the world met them with relatively little labor. It is worth being precise here, because this figure has been debated. The 3 to 5 hour estimate covers food acquisition, the hunting and gathering itself. When you add food processing, cooking, and tool maintenance, the total rises to somewhere around 6 to 7 hours per day, still significantly less than the dawn-to-dusk labor of early farming, but not quite the golden age of pure leisure that the headline figure sometimes implies. The point stands. Hunter-gatherers worked less and ate better than the farmers who came after them. The difference is one of degree, not direction. Their diets were extraordinarily varied. Depending on the region and season, a hunter-gatherer group might consume dozens or even hundreds of different plant species over the course of a year, along with multiple animal species, insects and shellfish. This dietary diversity translated directly into nutritional richness. Studies of ancient skeletal remains consistently show that pre-agricultural humans were taller, had stronger bones, better teeth, and fewer signs of nutritional deficiency than the farming populations that replaced them. They also had something early farmers entirely lacked: mobility. When conditions deteriorated, drought, disease, conflict, a hunter-gatherer group could move. Agriculture removed that option permanently. So what happened? Why did humans abandon a way of life that worked so well? The honest answer is that we are still not entirely sure, but we have some very compelling ideas. Here is something that will reframe the whole story. The first bread was not made by farmers. It was made by hunter-gatherers. In 2018, archaeologists excavating a site called Shubaika, one in northeastern Jordan, found the charred remains of flatbreads baked approximately 14,400 years ago. These are the oldest known bread remains ever discovered, and they predate the advent of agriculture by at least 4,000 years. The people who made them were Natufian hunter-gatherers, a culture that thrived across the Levant, modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, during a period when the climate was warmer and wetter than today, and wild cereals were abundant. The Natufians were not farmers. They had no cultivated crops, but they were harvesting wild grains, grinding them into flour using stone tools, mixing them with water and baking flatbreads on hot stones. They were making bread, before agriculture, before pottery, before permanent settlements of any real scale. And here is the twist that changes everything. Some researchers now believe that the process ran in reverse from what we always assumed. We used to think the sequence was humans settle down, humans start farming, humans develop bread. But the evidence increasingly suggests it may have been humans discover bread, bread is delicious and worth having reliably, humans start farming to ensure a steady supply. In other words, bread may not be a product of agriculture. Agriculture may be a product of bread, the desire for reliable access to something humans had already discovered they loved, that may have been the thing that pulled our ancestors out of their nomadic lives and planted them, quite literally, in the ground. The transition from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture, what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution, did not happen overnight. It was not a single decision made by a single group. It unfolded over thousands of years, independently, in at least a dozen different locations around the world, as different human populations arrived at similar solutions to similar pressures. But the earliest and most consequential of these transitions happened in a region known as the Fertile Crescent, a sweeping arc of relatively well-watered land running from modern-day Egypt up through Israel and Jordan, through Lebanon and Syria, across southern Turkey and down through Iraq to the Persian Gulf. It was here, on the hillsides and river valleys of what is now the Middle East, that the wild ancestors of wheat and barley grew in abundance. Einkorn wheat, emmer wheat, wild barley, grasses that produced edible seeds in sufficient quantities that communities of people began to rely on them heavily. The shift from harvesting wild grain to actively cultivating it was gradual and probably driven by a confluence of pressures, though archaeologists still debate precisely which pressures mattered most. One leading theory points to the Younger Dryas, a sudden cold snap beginning around 12,900 years ago, which reduced the availability of wild plants and game across the region, potentially pushing communities that had been harvesting wild grains toward more deliberate cultivation to compensate. On this view, adversity drove innovation. But a competing body of evidence suggests almost the opposite, that it was the unusually warm, wet, and stable climate of the Holocene, the period that followed the Younger Dryas, beginning around 11,700 years ago, that finally made long-term agriculture possible. Growing crops reliably requires predictable seasons and stable rainfall. The Younger Dryas was too erratic for sustained farming. The Holocene provided the conditions that made it viable, and agriculture followed almost immediately. On this view, opportunity drove innovation. Both arguments have merit. The most honest reading of the current evidence is that climate mattered enormously, but whether it was the crisis that forced the transition or the stability that enabled it remains genuinely open. What is clear is that populations had grown during the preceding warm period, meaning more mouths to feed, and that communities like the Natufians, who had already been harvesting and processing wild grains for generations, were well positioned to take the next step, deliberately sowing seeds, tending the resulting plants, and returning to the same place year after year to harvest. Once you have planted a crop, you cannot leave it. Agriculture doesn't just feed people, it anchors them. The field is an investment, the harvest is the return. And to protect that investment, you build a wall, you build a granary, you build a settlement. The town is, in a very real sense, a consequence of the field. And the field is, in a very real sense, a consequence of bread. Now, let's talk about what this transition actually did to the human body, because this is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable. The skeletal evidence from the early Neolithic is remarkably consistent across different parts of the world, and it tells a sobering story. When populations transitioned from foraging to farming, average human height dropped. In some regions, the ancient Middle East, early Europe, the decline was several centimeters over just a few generations. This is a direct marker of nutritional stress. Shorter stature in adults is a reliable signal that children did not have access to adequate protein and micronutrients during their growth years. Teeth deteriorated dramatically. Hunter-gatherer populations generally had strong, relatively intact teeth, with low rates of cavities. Early farming populations show dramatically increased rates of dental caries. Tooth decay. The reason is direct. A diet dominated by starchy carbohydrates, particularly processed grain, provides an ideal food source for the bacteria that produce tooth decay. The introduction of bread quite literally rotted our teeth at a population level within a few generations. Bones became thinner and more fragile. Iron deficiency, anemia, visible in the eye sockets and skull bones of ancient remains as a characteristic pitting called porotic hyperostosis, increased sharply. Infectious diseases exploded in ways that had simply not been possible before. Two factors drove this. First, dense, settled communities with poor sanitation allowed pathogens to spread through populations far more efficiently than they ever could among mobile hunter-gatherer bands. But second, and this is the part that should make you pause, living in close proximity to domesticated animals introduced entirely new categories of disease that had never affected humans before. Smallpox, measles, influenza, tuberculosis, the great killing diseases of human history, all originated in the livestock that early farming communities lived alongside. Cows, pigs, sheep, chickens. The animals we domesticated to feed us also gave us the diseases that would kill hundreds of millions of us across the following millennia. Life expectancy, at least in early childhood, declined sharply. By almost every measure of individual physical health, the early farmers were worse off than the hunter-gatherers they replaced, and yet the farming populations grew, much faster than the foragers. This is the paradox at the heart of the agricultural revolution, and it is worth sitting with. Farming produced more calories per unit of land than foraging. Even if those calories were nutritionally inferior, they were abundant enough to support higher population densities. More babies survived to adulthood, not because they were healthier individually, but because there was simply more food, more reliably available. The farming population outgrew and eventually displaced the foraging population, not because farming was better for the individuals living it, but because it was better for the population's numbers. Agriculture did not make humans healthier. It made there be more of us. Here is where bread stops being a food story and starts being a civilization story. The key word is surplus. Hunter-gatherers do not, in general, produce significant food surpluses. You gather what you need, you eat it, and you move on. You cannot store a deer for 6 months. You cannot stockpile the berries that will have rotted by next week. The hunter-gatherer economy is, by its nature, a present tense economy. Grain changes this entirely. Grain can be stored. Dried grain in a sealed container keeps for months, years, even decades. A good harvest can feed a community through a bad season. A very good harvest can feed people who are not growing the grain at all, people who are doing something else instead. And this is the moment when stored grain creates the possibility of specialization, that human society begins to look recognizably like our own. Think about what specialization means. If most of the community is growing grain and the grain surplus is large enough to feed a few people who are not growing grain, then those few people can do other things. One of them makes pots, better pots than anyone else, because it is all he does. One of them smelts metal. One of them builds walls. One of them keeps records of who owns which field and who owes how much grain to whom. That last person, the one keeping records, invents writing. The oldest writing systems we know of, the cuneiform script of ancient Mesopotamia, developed around 5,000 years ago, were not invented to record poetry or philosophy or history. They were invented to keep track of agricultural surplus. The earliest cuneiform tablets from the city of Uruk are administrative records, quantities of barley received and distributed, rations of beer allocated to temple workers, heads of cattle and sheep counted and accounted for. Grain, beer, livestock. The three pillars of the Mesopotamian agricultural economy, tracked in clay, pressed into permanence by a reed stylus. Writing, the technology that more than any other defines what we mean by civilization, began as a farm accounting tool. It goes further. Surplus grain requires storage, which requires granaries. Granaries require administration, which requires bureaucracy. Bureaucracy requires authority, which requires government. Government requires the ability to compel people to hand over some of their grain, which is to say, taxation. Taxation requires record-keeping. Record-keeping, again, requires writing. Follow the chain long enough, and you find that almost every institution that defines complex human society, the state, the law, the military, organized religion, money itself, has grain at its root, not as a metaphor, as a literal historical fact. Religion deserves its own moment here, because the relationship between grain and the sacred is one of the oldest and most persistent threads in human culture. Almost every agricultural civilization in history has deified grain or the forces that govern its growth. In ancient Egypt, Osiris, the god of the afterlife, resurrection, and fertility, was deeply associated with grain. He was depicted with green or black skin, the colors of vegetation and fertile soil. His murder and resurrection by Set and Isis was understood as the story of grain, the seed that dies in the ground and is reborn as a new plant. The annual flooding of the Nile, which deposited the fertile silt that made Egyptian agriculture possible, was understood as a divine gift. Bread was not just food in Egypt, it was theology. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerian goddess Niseba was the deity of grain, writing, and accounting, a combination that, given what we just discussed about the origins of writing, makes a certain perfect sense. The connection between grain and knowledge was obvious enough to the Sumerians that they housed them in the same goddess. In ancient Greece, Demeter, goddess of the grain harvest, was one of the most widely worshipped deities in the ancient world. The Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most important religious rituals of the ancient Greek world, were centered on the myth of Demeter and her daughter Persephone. The myth explained the seasons. Persephone's descent into the underworld each year caused the grain to die back in winter. Her return brought the spring harvest. The mystery rites, which initiates were sworn to secrecy about, almost certainly involved grain in some central ritual capacity. And then there is Christianity. In the Eucharist, the central ritual of Christian worship, bread becomes the body of Christ. The transformation of bread into the divine is not incidental to Christian theology. It is its most repeated ritual. Every week, in churches around the world, bread becomes sacred. The civilization built on grain kept finding ways to make grain holy, which, when you consider how utterly dependent those civilizations were on the harvest, makes a profound kind of sense. If your entire world rests on whether the grain grows or fails, it would be extraordinary not to pray about it. Grain is not just food and not just sacred. It is, throughout history, one of the most powerful tools of political control ever devised. Control the grain, and you control the people. In ancient Rome, the grain supply was not just an economic matter, it was a political one. The annona, the Roman grain distribution system, provided subsidized or free grain to a significant portion of the population of Rome. At its peak, hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens received a monthly grain dole. This was not charity, it was governance. The emperors understood that a city full of hungry people was a city on the edge of revolt. Keep the grain flowing and the population compliant. The Roman satirist Juvenal summarized it with a phrase that has echoed through history: bread and circuses. Give the people food and entertainment, and they will not trouble themselves with politics. The control of grain shaped military history too. Every army in the ancient and medieval world ran on bread. Logistics, the ability to feed soldiers on campaign, determined the outcome of wars as much as tactics or courage. Alexander the Great's ability to campaign across thousands of kilometers depended on his ability to keep his army supplied with grain. Napoleon's famous maxim that an army marches on its stomach was not new wisdom. It was a restatement of something every general, since the invention of agriculture, had understood. Grain taxes were the economic foundation of almost every empire in human history. The Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Empire, all of them extracted a portion of the agricultural surplus from their subjects as tax, and all of them ran on that grain. When the harvest failed, empires wobbled. When the harvest failed for several years in succession, empires fell. The French Revolution, one of the most consequential political events in modern history, was triggered in significant part by bread. The harvest of 1788 was catastrophic across France. Bread prices soared. By the spring of 1789, French urban workers were spending upward of 80 or 90% of their income on bread alone. The Women's March on Versailles in October 1789, one of the defining moments of the revolution, was driven directly by bread shortages in Paris. The women who marched were not marching primarily for abstract political rights. They were marching because their children were hungry. Before leaving the city, they raided the Paris armory for weapons. When they reached Versailles, they stormed the palace, forced their demands upon Louis XVI, and compelled the entire royal family to return with them to Paris the following day, ending a century of royal government at Versailles in a single night, all of it set in motion by the price of a loaf of bread. The politics of grain is the politics of survival, and survival, it turns out, is the most powerful political force there is. We should pause here and talk about what bread actually is, because the chemistry of bread is, in its own way, as remarkable as its history. Bread is not just flour and water. What transforms those ingredients into something light, soft, and digestible is fermentation, specifically the action of yeast and bacteria on the starches and proteins in the flour. Wild yeast spores are present in the air everywhere on Earth. When flour and water are combined and left at room temperature, wild yeasts colonize the mixture, consuming the sugars in the flour and producing carbon dioxide and alcohol as byproducts. The carbon dioxide gets trapped in the gluten network, the elastic protein structure that develops when flour is mixed with water, and it causes the dough to rise. When the dough is baked, that structure sets, giving bread its characteristic open, airy crumb. This process, sourdough fermentation, is thousands of years old. Ancient Egyptians used it. The Greeks used it. For most of human history, all leavened bread was sourdough, produced by maintaining a live culture of wild yeast and bacteria, a starter, that bakers kept alive by feeding it fresh flour and water every day. The sourdough fermentation process does something important beyond just making bread rise. The bacteria present in a sourdough culture, primarily lactobacillus species, produce lactic and acetic acids during fermentation. These acids break down some of the compounds in grain that can be difficult to digest, including phytic acid, which otherwise binds to minerals and prevents them from being absorbed. A properly fermented sourdough bread is meaningfully more nutritious and easier to digest than an unfermented one. Our ancestors did not know the biochemistry, but they could taste the difference and feel the effect. The discovery that leaving your dough to rest for a day or two made it better, lighter, more flavorful, more digestible, was one of the most consequential accidental discoveries in culinary history. Industrialization changed bread fundamentally. The introduction of commercial yeast in the 19th century, a selected, highly active strain of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, bred for speed and consistency, meant that bread could be made in hours rather than days. But the single most transformative technology was the steel roller mill, developed in the 1870s. Before its invention, all flour was stone ground. The entire wheat kernel was crushed between rotating stones, which distributed the oils from the germ throughout the flour and made true separation of bran and germ from the starchy endosperm extremely difficult and labor-intensive. Some sifting was possible, and wealthy households could afford finer, whiter flour, which is why white bread had been a status symbol for centuries. But achieving it at mass scale was essentially impossible with stone. The steel roller mill changed this entirely. Rather than crushing the grain, steel rollers broke open the wheat berry and mechanically sheared the endosperm away from the bran and germ with surgical precision, leaving a flour that was consistently white, fine, and shelf-stable. Stripping away the bran and germ, the parts of the wheat grain that contain most of the fiber, vitamins, and minerals, left mainly the starchy endosperm. White bread, for so long the privilege of the wealthy, could now be made cheaply and at enormous scale. Industrial milling made it available to everyone. But in making white bread cheap and universal, industrialization also stripped away much of what made bread nutritious in the first place. The fortification of bread, the addition of synthetic vitamins and minerals back into the flour after the natural ones have been removed, is an acknowledgement baked into the label of every mass-produced loaf of what the industrial process took away. So, let's come back to where we started, the trade. 10,000 years ago, humans gave up their freedom, their health, their mobility, and the richness of their varied diets, in exchange for the ability to grow grain reliably. On the face of it, a bad deal. But look at what that deal produced. It produced cities. It produced writing. It produced mathematics and astronomy and philosophy and law. It produced the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 years of human civilization, written down, preserved, transmitted and built upon by each generation. It produced the science that sent people to the moon and mapped the human genome and eradicated smallpox. It produced the art, the painting, the music, the literature, that gives human life much of its meaning. None of that is possible in a world where everyone spends their days finding food. The specialization that grain surplus made possible is the foundation of everything we recognize as civilization. The farmer feeds the potter frees the metalsmith enables the soldier protects the scribe preserves the knowledge of the philosopher asks the questions that the scientist eventually answers. Pull grain out of that chain, and the whole thing collapses. We did not know, when we planted the first seeds, what we were beginning. The Natufian, who ground wild wheat into flour on a stone 10,000 years ago and baked it on a hot rock, was not trying to build a civilization. She was trying to make something good to eat. She succeeded, beyond anything she could have imagined. The bread on your counter is the end of a 10,000-year chain of consequence. It cost our ancestors more than they understood when they chose it, and it gave us, more than anyone could have predicted. That, in the end, is what makes bread the most important food in human history. Not because it is the most nutritious, not because it is the most delicious, but because it is the food that turned us, slowly and irreversibly, from animals finding their place in nature, into the kind of animal that builds one.